Mark Buetow. This is Bible 101. It is very early in the morning on Friday, Good Friday, the Friday of Holy Week. The Jewish religious council, the Sanhedrin, made up of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priest and all those important folks, they did not have the power to put someone to death. They could not condemn someone because they were under Roman law. Only the Roman governor could do that. So, in order to actually kill Jesus, they had to take him to see the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. So, they take Jesus very early in the morning to the Praetorium, which is where the Roman governor stayed, and his soldiers and all that. And then they bring the charge before Pontius Pilate. This man is teaching people that there's, another king besides Caesar, and you have to condemn him, you have to crucify him, you have to kill him. And Pilate says, well, why? What has he done? Well, he's just a bad guy. He's telling people there's kings other than Caesar and so on. And so they bring their accusations before Pilate, which aren't really accusations. But here's what Pontius Pilate does. So the Jews accuse Jesus before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate says, well, what has the guy done? Well, we wouldn't have brought him here if he didn't do something wrong. Finally, he presses them to try and figure out what it is exactly that Jesus is accused of, but he can't figure it out because they simply say, well, he's trying to be seditious, that he says there's a king other than Caesar. Now, the Jews, of course, hated Caesar. They hated being under the Romans, but hey, if it was a convenient way to get rid of Jesus, they would accuse him of that. At one point, Pilate learns that Jesus was from Galilee, so he actually sends him to King Herod, who was king of Galilee, who was in town at the moment. But Herod, since he didn't get any miracles from Jesus, just made fun of Jesus a little bit and sent him back to Pontius Pilate. So it was going to be Pontius Pilate's decision what happens to Jesus. Pilate takes Jesus aside and says, listen, aren't you going to say anything? Jesus is quiet. Pilate is amazed that Jesus doesn't even speak up in his own defense. He says, don't you know, I'm Pontius Pilate. I'm the governor representing Caesar and the Roman Empire. I could crucify you or I could set you free. And Jesus said, you would have no power over me unless it was given to you. And by saying that, Jesus is reminding Pilate and us, as we hear his words, that this is all part of the plan. This is how Jesus is going to go to his death at the hands of this Roman governor. Now, Pontius Pilate says, listen, what is truth? Jesus, what is this kingdom? Jesus says, my kingdom's not from here. I'm not a king trying to overthrow the government. My kingdom is not from this world. And Pilate says, well, what is truth? And all this sort of thing. And he just can't understand what the big deal is with Jesus. So he ends up having Jesus sent out, and he has him scourged, which is to be whipped with the razor-tipped whips that the Romans would use on people to punish him, to make an example of him, I suppose, and then maybe that will get the Jews off his back to try and crucify what is clearly an innocent man. So Pilate brings Jesus back out in front of the crowd and says, behold the man, here he is, this is the guy. And they all say, crucify him, crucify him. Now crucifixion was pretty bad punishment. It was usually reserved for robbers and murderers and other criminals. And so Pilate says, well, why? What has he done? He said, crucify him. And they just yelled louder, and the religious leaders stirred up the crowds and yelled, crucify him. And Pilate says, why do I want to crucify him? And they said, he's made himself to be the king and made himself to be the Son of God and all this sort of thing. And Pilate says, fine. And so he says, listen, I've got a custom. I've got one last chance to set Jesus free. He's got this murderer named Barabbas who's in prison, and he's getting ready to go to the cross. Or I got Jesus. And since it's the feast of the Passover and unleavened bread and all that, I'll do my usual custom of letting you pick which one you want. And so they all cried for Barabbas. Well, what do you do with Jesus? Crucify him, they said. So finally, Pilate gives in. And so he gives the order for Jesus to be crucified. And then he says, get me some water, and I'm going to wash my hands, and I'm going to make a public show that I am not guilty of this man's blood. As if Pilate, by sending an innocent man to the cross, can not be guilty. But his point is, at least he's trying to show the Jews, that it's not his fault the guy's going to die. And the Jews say, let his blood be on us and on our children, which in some ways is sort of a prophecy that Jesus is dying, so his blood would be shed for them and for all the world. And so Pontius Pilate turns Jesus over to the guards, and they put a crown of thorns on him, and they put a staff in his hand, and they throw a purple robe on him. They have a little fun with him, make fun of him, pretend he's a king, and they beat him and worship him, faking and mockery and all these sorts of things, spit on him, slap him around, scourge him, and just generally have a good time at Jesus' expense, humiliating him, causing him to suffer. And then they load the cross up on up on him, and then they head out towards Golgotha or Calvary. Jesus had told his disciples over and over, the Son of Man is going to Jerusalem to be handed over to his enemies, to be spit upon, to be mocked, to be scorned, and to be ultimately handed over to the Gentiles and crucified and killed. But on the third day, rise again. And so it's all coming to pass just as Jesus had said. And this is all part of the plan, that Jesus is going to suffer all these things for our salvation. Next time on Bible 101, Jesus on the Cross. I'm Pastor Mark Buetow.